Most people won't subscribe to this channel. And honestly, maybe that's for the best. Because once you hear what really ended the Bronze Age, what no textbook dares to admit, you won't look at progress the same way again. So if you'd rather stay comfortable, don't click anything. But if you're the kind of person who needs to know what everyone else missed, then go ahead, hit subscribe, and let's dig up the past they tried to bury. Now is the age of iron. Not by day will there be rest, not by night peace. Now imagine this. What if he wasn't describing a metaphor, but a real global collapse? He wasn't exaggerating. Around 700 BCE, the old Greek poet wasn't describing myth. He was mourning something real, something lost. He had lived long enough to feel the difference, to remember whispers about a time before, when bronze was king, when cities traded light across oceans, when empires rose not from smoke, but from order. That world? Gone. And no one could say why it collapsed. Not really. Some say the gods turned their backs. Others just stopped asking. But the truth? It wasn't buried in myth. It was buried in metal. What you're about to witness is not the story of how humanity advanced. It's the story of what it cost to move forward. The chaos, the silence, the unraveling, and the quiet, brutal rise of something harder than bronze, harder than memory, iron. Now ask yourself something. If a world could collapse just because it relied on the wrong material, what are we building ours on? Before the fall came the glow. The Bronze Age world was not primitive. It was connected. Palaces glittered in Egypt. Ships danced across the Mediterranean. Caravans wove threads of trade through mountains and deserts. It was the first global system. Tin from Britain, copper from Cyprus, and in the forges of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Mycenaean Greece, bronze was born. But there was a flaw. This world didn't rest on armies. It rested on supply chains, on metals that had to be hauled from distant lands, melted down, and reshaped into the tools of empire. That's what made it powerful, and what made it fragile. Because the day those trade routes shattered, so did everything else. A merchant's letter. Final words from a kingdom unraveling. There is no copper in the storehouse. My lord, we are lost. And just like that, the lights of the Bronze Age began to blink out. The world didn't end in war. It ended in absence. No traders on the roads, no sails on the horizon, no offerings in the temples, and no answers. One by one, cities went quiet. Not burned, not conquered, just quiet. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae. Names that echoed across continents, now swallowed like a breath taken too deep. There were no enemy generals, no great last stands, just letters, hundreds of them, pressed into clay with shaking hands. Some of them survived, most didn't. But the ones that did tell a story no one wanted to believe. There's no copper left in the stores. Send grain, our people are dying. The enemy is at the gates, but we don't know who they are. They weren't asking for armies. They were asking for tin, a soft, pale metal, almost forgettable. And yet, without it, bronze meant nothing. The world had built itself on an invisible promise that the ships would always arrive, that trade would always flow, that distant hills would give up their gifts on time. And then one year, they didn't. Not because the earth ran dry, not because of war, but because too many things had to go right for the system to keep working, and nothing ever goes right forever. The sea peoples came later. That part's true, but they weren't an invading force. They were a symptom, refugees from drought, from famine, from lands swallowed by silence. But kings need enemies they can see, enemies they can carve into stone. So they gave them names and blamed them for everything. That's what power does in the dark. It looks for something to point at, anything but a mirror. This was the first global economy, the first supply chain, and it collapsed, not in blood, but in distance. Because no matter how rich your palace is, it means nothing if the ore doesn't arrive. No matter how many soldiers you feed, their weapons crumble if there's no tin to harden them. No matter how loud the priests chant, the gods do not answer if you can't pay for the incense. The Bronze Age wasn't primitive, it was brilliant. But brilliance is brittle, and when the last shipment failed to arrive, the world learned what it had been built on. Not stone, not faith, but a metal too rare to hold it all together. And yet, even in the ash, people kept digging, because something else had started to whisper. Not gold, not bronze, but something darker, something buried deeper, something colder. It didn't gleam, it didn't shine, but it didn't break either, and it was everywhere. They had seen it before, but only as fragments fallen from the sky. Metal not of earth, but of the stars. They'd called it sacred. They'd buried it with kings. They thought it was a gift from the heavens. But the heavens had nothing to do with it. It wasn't beautiful. It was stubborn, harder to shape, slower to yield. But in a world where bronze had betrayed them, iron offered something else: survival. Even if it cost them everything that came before, the world had collapsed, but something remained. Not a kingdom, not a god, not a song, just a sound. Assyria did not survive the Bronze Age collapse. It waited for it, and when the fires had cooled, when the last palace doors had crumbled, and the scribes had buried their tablets in shallow graves, Assyria rose, not with temples, with numbers, not with kings, with quotas. They didn't ask what was lost. They asked what could be standardized. They didn't rebuild cities. They processed them. Every spear tip, every sword, every shield, identical. Every soldier, interchangeable. The Bronze Age belonged to chariot lords. But chariots need horses. They need gold. They need names. Assyria didn't need any of that. They needed iron, and people willing to kill with it. The blacksmiths who once shaped divine weapons now worked under torchlight, guarded by men they armed. Iron used to be sacred. Assyria made it mandatory, and it worked. Babylon, Phoenicia, Judah, even Egypt, the old lion, felt its breath on the back of its neck. Assyria wasn't brilliant. It was efficient. It turned cities into quarries, people into logistics, history into supply. They didn't conquer the world. They streamlined it. But when you build an empire from iron, you forget that iron rusts. And when it does, what's left? Not beauty, not memory, just weight. The same tools that raised Assyria would one day be used to bury it. Far to the south, another world watched, one that had survived for longer than Assyria had even existed, a kingdom of river gods and golden crowns. They called themselves divine, but while they painted their tombs with the glory of the past, the future was already scraping at their borders. And it wasn't bronze. It was something harder and colder. And by the time they noticed, it was already inside. The floods, the famines, the outsiders, from the first kings carved in ivory to the golden gods of the new kingdom. Egypt had never fallen, not once. It was the last empire still standing, the only one left that remembered the Bronze Age, not through ruins or story, but through ceremony. Its temples still opened at dawn. Its gods still spoke in incense and stone. The Nile still flowed, the scribes still wrote, and the pharaoh still sat beneath the sun. But the world had changed, and Egypt hadn't. Every other civilization had collapsed, but Egypt didn't think it had survived. It thought it had won. In a world where the future had turned to ash, Egypt doubled down on the past. The gods had preserved them. So they offered more temples, more rituals, more bronze swords blessed by incense. The priests told stories of order restored, of enemies punished, of harmony returned. But outside the sacred halls, the air was wrong. Ships arrived less frequently. Caravans grew silent. Farmers whispered about raids in the north. And in the east, iron had begun to move. They had seen iron. They just refused to believe it mattered. Iron had appeared before. Meteoric fragments, heaven metal, weapons found with foreign bodies, swords pulled from ash and ruin. They tested it. They knew its strength, but they called it ugly, too stubborn, too impure. Bronze was sacred, iron was base, and sacredness mattered more. A letter preserved from the reign of Ramesses XI records a warning. The black metal cuts too deeply. It does not honor the sun. So they dismissed it. They didn't adapt. They rationalized. They buried the iron blade. The first swords that Egypt could not break did not come from the east. They came from the south. Cush had watched. As Egypt stagnated, Nubia learned. It carved iron from the mountains, forged it in pits fed by goat bellows. They didn't worship it. They used it. And when the Nile turned northward, they followed, not as raiders, as kings, the 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs. They wore the double crown. They spoke Egyptian. They rebuilt temples and honored Amun. But they carried something the pharaohs never had, iron, and Egypt bent. The gods didn't fall. They were outpaced. In Thebes, the rituals continued, but fewer people came. Amun no longer spoke. The statues had been cleaned, the scrolls rewritten, but something had shifted. Bronze knives dulled faster. Tools broke in the fields. New iron plowshares arrived from the south, unblessed, unasked for, and they worked. Too well. Even the skeptics couldn't deny it. The gods had protected Egypt, but iron fed it. In the end, it wasn't conquest that broke Egypt. It was time. The sharp hiss of iron on limestone. He finishes a tomb inscription 3 days faster than before. He says nothing, just works. Egypt outlived the Bronze Age. It outlasted Assyria. It weathered invasion after invasion. But its soul had already changed. The temples still stood. The Nile still ran. But something had rusted beneath the gold. By the time iron arrived in full force, Egypt no longer resisted. It no longer remembered why it ever did. The thing they feared had become the thing they needed, and so it entered their graves, their myths, their blood. Herodotus would later say the Egyptians used iron to cut stone. He was wrong. They used it to cut time, and by then it was already too late. They preserved everything, except the future, and so Egypt became what it always feared, a lesson. They called it a collapse. But what if it was something else? Not an ending, a reset. And in the silence, something new began to whisper. Iron hadn't just ended the old world. It was about to build something stranger. It shouldn't be here. Not in this soil, not in this century, but it is. 1050 BCE Greece. The palaces are gone. The scribes are silent. The gods, well, they don't talk anymore. And yet this, an iron blade buried in the earth, forged in a time history says had no forges. Someone is lying. You're taught to trust chronology. But what happens when the metal doesn't care? Lefkandi was supposed to confirm the void, a gap, a pause. But the grave they uncovered was too elaborate, the structure too precise, and inside, weapons, not bronze, iron, tempered, blood-stained, not decorative, used. She doesn't say it out loud, But she knows this was a kingdom, not a campsite. She realizes she's not exhuming memory. She's disturbing something still breathing. So who put it there? And what were they trying to erase? Homer didn't write history. He built a weapon you could chant. Homer gave us Achilles with a bronze sword, but he held an iron one. Why would he sing of bronze when iron fed his village? Because myth doesn't preserve truth. It preserves order. Bronze meant hierarchy, nobility, palaces. Linear B. Iron meant rebellion, villages, blacksmiths who bowed to no king. So Homer wrote a world that never really ended, because if the age of heroes had collapsed, then who were they? Just scavengers with black knives. Number they were sons of Odysseus, descendants of Hector, even if it wasn't true. An orphan boy crying as he hears of Achilles, believing his father died in glory. He didn't. He starved. But what if the stories weren't lies for us? What if they were lies against someone else? The collapse didn't erase civilization. It redistributed it. The wheeze of bellows, the scream of metal quenching, iron dust clinging to sweat. He doesn't write. He doesn't pray. He builds hooks, nails, blades. And for this, his neighbors come to him like he's holy. In the absence of palaces, utility became sacred. In the shadow of silence, function became power. There were no scrolls, no archives, no lawgivers, just iron. And those who knew how to shape it. These were not citizens. They were survivors. And survival has no nostalgia. But silence is unstable. Eventually, someone would want to speak again. And that's where the myth returns. When history reappears, it's always written by those who learn to use silence. A Greek noble in the 8th century BCE descended from nothing, claiming descent from gods. He wears borrowed bronze. He steps into a rebuilt temple. He recites lines etched in borrowed tongue. They had no lineage, so they invented one, using Homer, using myth, using the blood of the villages they now claimed. What was the Greek Renaissance, if not a coup d'etat of memory? The new city-states were old skins. Sparta pretended it had always been strong. Athens pretended it had always been wise. But underneath, the iron still hissed. They had not emerged from the ashes of the Bronze Age. They had burned the ashes to warm new thrones. And if that past was buried in Greece, where else is it hiding? Every civilization hides the violence of its rebirth. You, a modern viewer, listening, wondering if the ground beneath your own city holds a blade no one has named. There was no dark age. There was only a silence so thick it took centuries to scream through it. The heroes of Greece, iron-wielding warlords rewriting a memory they never had. The myths we hold, not to remember, but to distract, not to enlighten, but to control. History isn't a flame, it's a forge. And the world you live in was hammered out of lies. They told us this was the age of forgetting, but maybe it was the age of erasure, and someone made sure the light never came back on, while Greece was busy rewriting its past. Another civilization was building a future, out of nothing but earth, fire, and blood. They didn't just adapt to iron, they weaponized it, and from their forges rose a patchwork of kingdoms that would change the course of Asia. Next, India. The kingdoms that iron built. The fire didn't just shape weapons, it redrew the spine of civilization. He wasn't supposed to own it. Not that blade, not that field, not that choice, but he did. The man who had never set foot in a palace, never heard Sanskrit, never bowed to a priest, now wielded the black edge of empire. Iron, it came not with a king's decree, but with a whisper in the jungle, a tool passed hand to hand, first for plowing, then for fighting, then for deciding who got to eat. Say whisper became a storm, a storm that redrew India's ancient spine, not with law, not with language, with steel. And it terrified the men at the top. The story of India's Iron Revolution didn't begin with a kingdom. It began with a tree and the decision to cut it down. They weren't warriors. They were farmers. They weren't kings. They were kin. But iron doesn't care who you are. It simply asks, can you shape me before I break you? And from the ruins of Indus stone and the echo of Vedic chants, a new sound emerged. The clank of metal, the crack of bark, the grunt of conquest, not over people, but land. Forests burned, roads emerged, fields multiplied. But behind every step of progress stood a man with a forge. The kings of Magadha didn't inherit greatness, they forged it. While other realms debated Dharma, Magadha built roads. While others waited on omens, Magadha fed armies. And the secret wasn't in their scriptures. It was in their soil, iron-rich, river-fed, flame-hungry. Their blades came faster, their plows cut deeper, and when war came, they did not chant, they marched. Iron democratized violence, but Magadha centralized it. And for the first time, India didn't just have land, it had infrastructure. But when the tools of liberation become state property, what happens to those who once held them? You thought caste was eternal? Think again. It calcified when the ground started to shake. Before iron, caste was flexible. After iron, it became weaponized. Because when the lower classes started feeding empires, when the smiths began deciding life and death, when the man with a hammer could out-earn a man with a hymn, the priests rewrote the rules, not through war, through ritual, not with swords, with status. Caste wasn't protection, it was a reaction, a firewall, a last gasp from those who saw power slipping into unfamiliar hands. The father replies, because they say we're meant to serve. But what happens when even the gods start to look forged? Magadha built with iron, but it also cracked open the mind. From the center of empire came a whisper of doubt. Why should birth decide worth? Why should gods demand silence? Why should a blade be holier than a question? And so the forest schools bloomed. Jains, Buddhists, Ajivikas. Outsiders turned founders, each one hammering at the walls of tradition with the same iron the kings had once used to build them. The kings could control land. But could they control thought? India's Iron Age wasn't a tool revolution. It was a narrative reset. We say technology changes things, but iron didn't just change how people lived. It changed who was allowed to live fully. And when history speaks of kings and sages, ask, who cleared the forest? Who mined the ore? Who shaped the blade? Who was written out, even as they built everything? India didn't just build kingdoms from iron, it built control, it built challenge, and it built a question that still hasn't been answered. When power is forged from silence, who gets to speak? But while India debated the soul of the blade, China did something unthinkable. They dissolved it. They took iron to its breaking point and created something so powerful the West wouldn't catch up for 1,000 years. He thought it was a sword. It wasn't. It was a signature, stamped, registered, recorded, filed not in temples but in ledgers. The Qin dynasty didn't just conquer China, it categorized it. And while the rest of the world was still whispering bronze prayers into blades, China turned iron into statecraft. You've been told that iron was born in the West, that Europe led the way, that China was the slow dragon, waking centuries late. But here's the secret buried under every Western textbook. China wasn't behind, it was ahead, by over 700 years. While Celts beat iron like animals and Greeks romanticized bronze, Chinese blacksmiths melted iron into liquid thought. Blast furnaces, bellows powered by treadle, scaled molds, an industrial revolution before anyone knew what industry meant. But once you control the fire, how long until the fire controls you? Everyone remembers the terracotta army, but no one tells you what stood next to it. Beside the clay, men stood kilns, not for pottery, for weapons. Each sword cast in perfect proportion, stamped with the date, the maker, the inspector. Not for gods, not for kings, for files. He doesn't speak much anymore. He just watches the molds fill. This wasn't war. This was logistics. And the first war China truly mastered was against waste. But what happens when the machine you build forgets you? Most empires rise on blood. China rose on forms. By 117 BCE, the Han Dynasty did something no one expected. It outlawed private furnaces. Why? Because it understood the deepest threat to power isn't rebellion. It's autonomy. Independent iron meant independent armies, independent tools, independent futures. So they nationalized heat. A furnace master kneels before an envoy. He begs to keep his forge. He's denied. His tools are taken. His apprentices vanish. His heat dies. He watches his last ember fade, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. Now imagine a state so paranoid it fears fire itself. You think mass production equals freedom? China weaponized efficiency. Iron plows, iron pots, iron locks, iron laws. From the moment you were born, the state gave you tools. But they weren't gifts. They were cages in disguise. Every tool was state-issued, every mold tracked, every advance calculated. So while China's peasants harvested more food, they also harvested more surveillance. But it bears a serial number. And when it breaks, she can't replace it. Only request one. She never gets a response. What if progress is just obedience in prettier packaging? The emperor fell. The dynasties turned to dust. But the iron never stopped. In the end, China's brilliance became its ghost. The forges remained. The methods outlived the makers. Even today, archaeologists unearth standardized tools, indistinguishable from others 500 miles away. A civilization so precise its soul got lost in replication. The West industrialized in the 1800s. China? In the 200s BCE. But when fire becomes bureaucracy, when mastery becomes monotony, you don't just lose kings, you lose wonder. While China whispered fire into silence, one man in the West turned it into a scream. He didn't want control. He wanted to be God. They gave him a gladius the day he earned his citizenship. Short, simple, deadly, not an heirloom, a requirement. Rome didn't ask him to think. It asked him to comply. That sword wasn't a gift. It was an expectation. They weren't just soldiers. They were inventory. Rome's empire wasn't built by kings. It was built by quotas. Every soldier was a line item. Every sword a line of credit. The gladius wasn't ornamental. It was logistical perfection, measured to stab, not swing, built to be used by thousands the same way. Because Rome didn't want warriors. It wanted repetition. But if every soldier is replaceable, what happens when one refuses to be? Rome's pride? Borrowed. Its sharpest blades? Foreign. The most feared swords in the empire came not from Rome, but from Noricum, a Celtic region, independent, resistant, skilled beyond what Rome could replicate. So Rome did what it always did. It absorbed them. At first through trade, then through treaty, then through force. Because Rome didn't fear enemies who fought. It feared enemies who could outforge. But you can't conquer genius, and Noricum never forgot who the steel belonged to. Rome forged identity through steel. The Celts broke it. The Celtic warrior fought like thunder. But when the battle ended, he crushed his sword, deliberately, publicly. Sometimes while still standing in his enemy's blood. It wasn't superstition, it was rebellion, a rejection of iron as ownership, a declaration, this blade serves me, not the state. What if the weapon isn't the threat? What if the belief behind it is? Rome didn't fall from invasion. It collapsed under its own paperwork. Every campaign, every fort, every meal built on iron math. 10,000 nails per ship, 4,000 swords per legion, 2 pounds of iron per soldier per week. The empire ran not on vision, but stockpiles. Warehouses, inventories, ledgers thicker than poetry. When your world is built on exactitude, even one missing nail can unravel empires. Rome's iron once answered to Caesar, then it answered to no one. The gladius became the one weapon every power could wield. The Senate, the rebels, the guards, the mob. It became common, and when something becomes common, it stops answering to authority. This was Rome's final innovation, a weapon so democratic, it made loyalty obsolete. Iron united Rome, then divided it, because no empire survives when everyone has a sword, and no one remembers why. But where Rome died by its own edge, a new world began, where belief, not birthright, forged empires. One language, one God, one sword. They said progress meant peace, but buried under every quiet field is a lesson we were never supposed to remember. Iron changed the world, but not the way you were told. What if iron wasn't the next step in evolution, but the first nail in its coffin? Iron made tools for the plow and blades for the throat. The same forge fed the people and burned their cities. The Greeks hailed it, the Chinese perfected it, the Romans industrialized it, and everywhere iron promised one thing: more. More crops, more weapons, more control. But when more became the only metric, human life became just another input. The empire was stronger than ever, until it wasn't. The real danger wasn't what iron made. It was what iron made us believe. Hesiod said the Iron Age would be bitter, cruel, tiring. We thought he meant hardship, but maybe he meant something else: addiction. The blade became sacred, the forge divine. We didn't just use iron, we built our gods around it. Pharaohs gave it to generals, kings gave it to peasants, peasants gave it to each other, and with each handoff, another illusion fell. Authority wasn't in blood anymore. It was in who controlled the furnace. The age of strength was born, but strength, untethered, has no mercy. Iron gave everyone a weapon, so why did it rebuild the walls higher? Iron plows broke new ground, and caste systems hardened. Rome gave soldiers swords and bound them in pensions. India gave farmers sickles and locked them in status. The illusion of mobility came wrapped in steel. Families worked the same iron mines for generations, yet never owned the tools they forge. Liberation was sold in bulk, but the receipt never reached the poor. We thought we were sharpening justice. We were tempering submission. Empires don't always fall in flames. Sometimes they rust. The Bronze Age ended in fire. The Iron Age ends in fatigue, not with invasions, but with systems stretched too thin, trade routes cracking, agriculture failing, weapons piling up in silent warehouses. And no one knows why it all feels like it's about to break. The forge is still hot, but no one comes to collect the blades. This wasn't a fall, it was a slow forgetting. You don't live in the Iron Age, but you're standing in the same fire. We build not with iron now, but with code, lines of logic, chains of servers, invisible tools, just as rigid, just as fragile. The supply chains that fed Rome now circle the globe. The mines are still there, only now they extract data. And the forges? They hum in server farms beneath our feet. Every lesson we refuse to learn is staring us in the face. Centralization, dependency, blind belief in permanence. We've replaced the sword with the smartphone, and we think it makes us safe. When the forge goes quiet, it doesn't scream, it whispers. And history has shown, again and again, we're terrible at hearing whispers. So now the hammer is in your hand. The forge still burns. For now. But ask yourself, what are you building? And will it remember you? Or bury you? We always think we'll see it coming. The collapse, the silence, the end. But we never do. because it never looks like ruin at first. It looks like convenience. It sounds like innovation. It feels like progress until it doesn't. History is full of forges, but every flame, every single one, starts with a whisper, a promise. This time, it'll be different. Iron was supposed to liberate. Instead, it structured obedience. The plow became the tax. The blade became the badge. The forge became the throne. And from Egypt to China to Rome to India, power wasn't inherited anymore. It was smelted. You've been told that civilizations collapse in fire. That's wrong. They collapse in meetings, in inventories, in moments when no one says anything, but everyone knows something is about to break. Rome didn't fall because it ran out of swords. It fell because it believed it could always make more. The Iron Age didn't end. It got repackaged into convenience, into logistics, into a system so vast it forgot the people inside it were still human. This wasn't about metal. It never was. This was about a species chasing power and calling it destiny. Iron was our first addiction to control, and like all addictions, it demanded sacrifices. Families split, languages erased, ideas chained. But the worst part? We learned to call that progress. And behind it, silence. You're standing in a forge right now. No soot, no hammer, no flame. But everything you know is still being shaped. Your work, your speech, your beliefs. Forged not by emperors, but by algorithms. By systems we don't see, written in lines of code instead of veins of ore. It's no longer kings who ask for tribute. It's data centers. We are more connected than ever. And yet, we stand on the edge of another silence. Not because we ran out of iron, but because we forgot what to do with it. Here is your final truth. No civilization ever thought it would be the last. They all had engineers, and scholars, and optimists. But they also had blind spots, and echoes they refused to hear. Hesiod called it, not a prophecy, not a metaphor, a diagnosis. The Iron Age wasn't an era, it was a condition. And the symptoms, they're all around you. We were told iron made us strong, but strength isn't what endures. Memory does. The question is, will anyone remember us? Or will we be the ones buried in someone else's silence? You made it to the end. That means you saw the patterns, the lies, the silence that swallowed entire empires. You saw what happens when the forge goes unchecked, when memory is replaced by comfort, when people stop asking and start obeying. So now the question isn't what happened, it's what are you going to do with it? You don't subscribe to a channel like this because it's trending. You subscribe because something deep down told you, this is already happening again. Not in ruins, not in swords, but in systems, in screens, in silence. The next Iron Age won't need forges. It just needs forgetfulness. So if you're still watching, don't just leave. In. Don't just think. In. Mark this moment. Subscribe. Because the past doesn't echo unless someone listens. And if you don't, just pray your descendants don't study you like we studied them.